Hello everyone and welcome to Book Solid. We're your hosts. I'm Soraya.
And I'm India. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing the book The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. Spoiler alert. Hey guys, just as a heads up, we will be revealing spoilers in this episode. If you haven't yet read the book or seen the show or film, this is a courteous reminder to proceed with caution.
So, The Vanishing Half. Where do we even begin? There's so much to unpack with this.
Yes, definitely.
Let's start, I guess, with the city of Mallard, because I think it just serves such an important part of the story, or serves an important purpose in the story, and really helps us to understand why a lot of the characters are the way they are.
Yeah, definitely. I just feel like, so the moment I started reading it, I felt like I was reading like some kind of horror novel, or I was in a horror film, because like
Get Out vibes.
No, literally, like they took it there, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a lot of confusion surrounding the residents of Mallard because I don't understand them. They make it a point multiple times in the story to share that, like, they don't want to be black, or I'm sorry, they don't want to be white, but they want to be as light as possible for being black. Like, I think there was a line specifically where he was like, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, and hold on, I wrote a quote. Let me try to find it real quick. They said they would never pass for white, but didn't want to be treated like other Negroes.
Oh my gosh.
Like, speechless. Like, I'm still speechless now. I don't even know what to say about that.
Yeah, it's crazy to like even begin to unpack that, because like you said, everyone in the community is very aware that they're black, and that other people can still see that they are black or of African descent. However, this very small town is very concerned with essentially like breeding people who are closer and closer to being white, but still have, black DNA. And it's bizarre. It doesn't make sense. Brit Bennett definitely is making a social commentary statement on colorism.
It's an issue that, it can be very divisive in our community. This, idea that people of a certain hue are better, prettier, pick an adjective, than their counterparts with deeper complexions. And it's just something I've seen in my own personal life. Like, many times people feed into that. Like, I know someone who is mixed, they're half black, half white, and they posted a picture on their Instagram saying light skins do it better. Or this kid I knew in high school who someone asked him, he was black, and someone asked him like, oh, would you date a black girl? And he pointed at me and he was like, yeah, but no one darker than her. I don't understand how you could possibly feed into that, or even like think it's okay to say something like that. And like, for that Instagram post, it's like, light skins do what better? Why create division in your own community when we already are facing so much oppression and discrimination from others? It's like, we should be united, and why would you contribute to further conflict within our own community? It's something I just don't understand.
No, that's perfectly said. I think the thing that's most illuminating with this idea of colorism is a lot of times some folks will say that they feel like racism doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never existed. But I think this idea of colorism, it's definitely like, it dates back to slavery. So 400 years ago, there was this notion that black is lesser than, and, not ideal. And so the fact that this idea has been embedded into the black community itself by people who are black, that's just like, that's so much, it's too much for me to process. Similarly, when I was in high school, we were in the Black Student Union, and like every year we had this conference in February, and I'll never forget it. I don't even know why it came up, but like, we had guest speakers, and one of the guest speakers, like, they were just posing questions to the audience. And so they asked us, they're like, to the men in the audience, which, first of all, this is, for many reasons, this is problematic. We're like 16, 17, 15 through 17. And they're like, to all my men in the room, just shout out your ideal woman. Like, we're in this huge conference room. There's hundreds of us. The first thing a lot of guys in the room said is, we want a light-skinned girl. red bone, yellow bone. And like the fact of the matter is like this conference, it was the talk of the year. Like it happened once a year. We all got super dressed up, we're dressed to the nines or like whatever the saying is. To hear that, it was just like, it was baffling. Like we're talking about going to college, we're talking about, just empowerment in the Black community. And to say something so divisive and so I felt like I was just being erased in that moment. Cause like, I know
Hmm.
you guys can't see us cause we're a podcast, but I'm of darker complexion. And so I was just thinking like, and then another thing is like, colorism isn't really talked about directly. It's like this
Mm.
elephant in the room. We hear it, especially like, I listen to a lot of rap music. A lot of popular rap artists right now have said colorist things in the past. And it's like, how out of touch can you be? Like, do you know who your fan base is? Do you care?
On top of that, like the thing that blows my mind is to people who say that, you're saying that you don't believe that deeper skin or darker skin women are beautiful, but that's your mom, that's your sister, that's your cousin. And so it's just very telling to me like how you feel about yourself.
Absolutely. Like, when you're discussing colorism and people who are colorist, I think it's a direct, correlation to self hate. Because,
Mm-hmm.
at the end, you have to look into yourself. And just the fact that it's something so, like, superficial and so, like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So Mallard is very problematic. And in that town, we meet the Veen sisters. They're twins.
What are some of, I guess, your thoughts or opinions on Desiree as a character?
Yeah. So it's interesting because the twins are carefully described as being, very fair in complexion. They are Black, their parents are Black, but, like everyone in Mallard, they intentionally want to be as close to white as they can be. However, I feel like Desiree was definitely frowned upon by both her family and other people in the town. I feel like early on, she was starting to question this idea and question this notion of, whiteness being the epitome of success. So, what's really interesting with her character is the fact that there's so many negative attributes attached to her, and I think they're attached to her intentionally by the author Brit Bennett for that reason. So, like, they described her as being jittery. I believe it was kind of implied that she was not the smartest between the two. Stella was like more into books, and Desiree was more into acting at the time. I could be mixing it up.
No, no, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, so like Desiree was into acting, and early on, she seemed like she wasn't so much attached to what they represented.
She dreamed of really nothing more than leaving that city, and
Mm-hmm.
everything it meant, and kind of everything it could keep you from becoming. Like, because I think it was her idea originally for her and Stella to run away, if I'm not
Mm-hmm.
mistaken. Real quick, one more thing about Mallard. Something that just like drove me insane while I was reading it is everyone's constant fixation on Jude's skin. In the
Mm-hmm.
book, it's stated multiple times that Jude is a very, very deep complexion, which apparently is not very hard to do in Mallard, but even by their standards, you know that she's pretty deep. But the constant fixation, like when they, and we'll kind of get into this more when we talk about Desiree, but when Desiree and Jude move back, Jude is 6 years old, and I
Mm-hmm.
just can't imagine a world where people are so just completely thrown by the skin of a 6 year old. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like it was just something she heard every single day. And the something that really stuck out to me was when she just couldn't take it anymore and she tried to lighten her skin and she went to her
Yeah.
grandma. And instead of her grandma trying to like just reaffirm like you are beautiful, who you are, own who you are, her grandma gave her remedies that would help her.
Right.
She was like, oh, because she wanted lightening cream and her grandma was like, oh, I have things that work better. And it's just so telling of the mentality in Mallard.
Yeah, it was honestly was heartbreaking. Like you said, she's 6 years old. And something that struck out to me was pretty much like anytime they would describe Jude early on, they would use the word blue black to
Mm-hmm.
like discuss her complexion. And even just like the introduction scene when Desiree comes back after, so the twins have left, like they were 16. I think at this point they're like in their 20s. And Desiree goes back. And when she meets her grandma for the first time, you could just sense like her disapproval and like the psychological impacts that must have on Jude. It's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. and I was just gonna say, because I guess I mean we're talking about Desiree coming back. What I really didn't like was her mom's insinuation that because Desiree's husband was abusive to her, and that is why she returned to Mallard to get away from him. But I just didn't like her mom's insinuation of like, that's what you get for marrying a man that dark. What did you think he was going to do to you? That's basically how her mom came off. And I just, it again, like, I know we're going to keep saying this, but I just don't understand how you could think this way, act this way about your people. This is the community that you belong to. You know who you
Mm-hmm.
are as a Black person. It's like, why would you sit there and like feed into all of these awful stereotypes about Black people?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, like you said, something that's frustrating with that whole situation too is just the fact that, that just happened to be what happened in that relationship. It's very unfortunate. And they described it early on. They were very close, they worked together. And then later on, his abusive side started to come out and, everything that happened that would lead her to running away. But I'm curious. I would like to know why Brit Bennett decided to. So the first dark skinned adult character, from what I could be wrong, but like one of the main ones in the twins' life is, of course, Desiree's first husband, and he just so happens that he's abusive and a terrible person, which is a very common stereotype and trope throughout media, and it has been for years. And so it was kind of like disheartening because it was kind of reinforcing that. And granted, I would say like that's kind of challenged directly later on.
Mm-hmm.
But I just kind of wish that wasn't the case.
I agree. Like, I was wondering the exact same thing of why, because I'm sure there has to be a reason why she wouldn't have done it if it didn't serve a purpose. I'm just not sure what that purpose is. Like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's just going right over my head. But I thought the same thing because it's like, for the twins, they split off in life and we'll get to why. But, Desiree specifically says that she went and she married the blackest man she could find. Those were her exact
Mm-hmm.
words. And we know Stella left and she's passing for white now, and she married a white man. And so, like you're saying, I'm just curious as to why Sam, Desiree's husband, was written as an abusive character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then to just kind of touch on it further, I'm blanking on the twins' mom's name.
Adele.
Adele, yes. So, yeah, Adele's, just clear colorism and all the negative attributes she's attached to Sam, which again, like he was an awful person, but he's not at all representative of every single darker complected Black person in America in that time. And that's kind of like the way she was
Mm-hmm.
talking. And something that just stuck with me, that just really quickly going back to this idea of Mallard, is the fact that the twins early on lost their father. Twice he was lynched. And I believe they were saying that he wrote a foul letter to a white woman, but everyone in the town kind of immediately discredited that because their father didn't know how to read or write. And
Yeah, and
so,
then I think they said that they were trying to mask the real reason, which is that he was taking business from them. And so then they
mm-hmm,
used that letter as the reason why. Even though, like, even if it was true, it doesn't give you the right to. I believe what happened to him is they showed up at his house, dragged him outside, stepped on his hands until they broke each one of his fingers and shot him 4 times, I think, and then he lived, and then they stabbed him in the hospital. Is that correct?
yeah. I mean, just reading
So
that,
hard to read,
that
yeah.
was so hard to read. And the fact that, this heinous, awful, gruesome crime was committed, this town is focused so much on.
I just want to add that all happened while his daughters were watching. They hid in the closet when the men came in to take their dad, and they saw everything that happened to him.
And so, you have the twins witnessing this, but the fact of the matter is, they were still able to quickly discern that he was still of African descent, that he was Black. Even
Mm-hmm.
if he was lighter in complexion, they knew at the end of the day he was a Black man, and, they killed him in cold blood because of it. And so the fact that in Mallard, they must still be aware of the blatant racism and the issues they face being of Black heritage, the fact that they're still able to just say such disparaging things to darker skinned people, and it's it's really hard to read. I'll just say that.
And just for them to, like you're saying, just to act like you're above it because you're of lighter complexion, like that doesn't matter clearly with what
Mm-hmm.
happened to the twins' father. As they said, one drop is enough. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter how light you are, it's not going to give you any more privilege in this world. So to try to separate yourself and act like you're above these things happening to you, or, that you'll be seen differently because of your complexion, it's not really the case.
Right. And then just as we're watching Jude growing up in Mallard, I don't know, maybe it was just me, but I just kept hoping Desiree would leave again.
I even wrote that down in my notes. I can't understand why she would choose to raise her daughter there. Jude had no friends. She was bullied relentlessly. Her own people in her own family, would have comments about the color of her skin. I'm just like
Hmm.
really curious why Desiree made the decision.
Right. And the way it's described, Desiree is probably the more progressive between the two. I was waiting for her to just sit down and have that talk with Jude, especially if they, ended up staying as long as they did, which they did, because I felt like, especially early on, she was kind of beating around the bush. And, Jude literally was like, "Why are they staring at me? Like, what's going on?" And she was just like, "Oh, it's because you're new. You know
Yeah.
damn well."
Yeah, and like Jude can see that she looks different from everybody else. And that's your daughter. Like stick up for your daughter. Stick up for her with these townsfolk. Stick up for her with your mom for sure. I mean, that's
Hmm.
her grandmother. Like just have her back.
That must have been so isolating and so lonely for Jude to realize on her own what was going on, because her own mother, for whatever reason, she couldn't be direct with her daughter. She wasn't ready to have that conversation. And so I just was thinking to myself, like, Jude had to, I mean, I don't even know if she had a word for it. She's just like, "This is what's going on because I'm darker." Literally everyone in the entire town treats me differently.
For her to, she put, and it's not, I'm not blaming her in any way. I was going to say she put so much self-worth in the color of her skin because that's how everybody treated her. So that became like her measure for like how much she could be loved. And so to see her work through, I feel like the lasting impact that that had on her, and work through not only like being confident in who she is, realizing that that isn't what defines you as a person. The scene that stuck out to me with that was some boy that she went to school with who teased her relentlessly about her skin since elementary school. And
Hmm.
then they ran into each other one day in high school, like late at night, because she was going for a run. And they ended up kissing. And then they started meeting up, at night when everyone was asleep and whatever, doing what teenagers do. And early, Desiree's boyfriend now at this time saw her sneak out, and he followed her and took her home and was yelling at her. And he was saying, "If you want to see a boy, he can come to the house and pick you up and take you out, but you don't sneak out to see any boy." And she was
Hmm.
like, "He won't take me anywhere else." And that made me so, because she knew like he would never want to be seen with her in public during the day. Like he was so ashamed of how she looked that he could only be with her in private. But to
Right.
her, with everyone telling her how dark she is and how it's not attractive, that's the love that she thought she deserved. She's like, "This is the only person who's going to like me. And if he doesn't want to see me in public, I'm going to take what I can get." And that was just
Right.
so sad. Like, just to see, like I said, just how much of her self worth was put into the color of her skin.
Right. And like with that situation, there's definitely some foreshadowing early on. It also just broke my heart when he was introduced. They were like in class and he was saying rude colorist comments. There was some dialogue where like she was basically saying she knows that what he's saying is wrong and rude, but it felt good to have attention from someone who is deemed
Mm,
attractive and popular. She's so lonely. She's literally isolated by the entire community, and she was just glad to be seen, and like, someone was paying attention to her. But
yeah.
the fact that, it was for all the wrong reasons, it hurt. Transitioning into Jude's adult life, I will say I'm really glad with her character arc. It was so refreshing for her to finally be in a healthy relationship where
Hmm.
she was treated as human, where her complexion wasn't the highlight of the relationship at all. It rarely came up with her interactions with her boyfriend Reese. And so that was a good change in her life, I feel like.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too, I love What I love about Reese and Jude's relationship is kind of just like what they could be, what they were for each other. Because
Mm-hmm.
Jude, as we mentioned, grew up in a place where she was never accepted for who she was. And so did Reese. Because when we
Mm-hmm.
meet Reese, he's transitioning from female to male, and he actually had to flee from his home because his father was beating him, and he was just facing judgment for trying to be himself. And
Right.
so it was just, I think, just a really beautiful thing for like them to come together. And they were pretty much the only two people in each other's lives who truly just loved them for the person that they were. I feel like neither of them had had any kind of experience like that before.
Right. And I feel like there's this interesting parallel between Reese's journey and Stella's journey because they both, fled their home to leave a toxic community and reinvent themselves, but it's done
Hmm.
in completely drastically different ways.
I agree. And that's an interesting point that you bring up because I was reading an article about the book after I finished it. And the author of the article made a really good point of saying just like a constant theme in the book is how you can be different people in the same lifetime. And I feel like that's just a
Mm.
theme that's explored in a lot of characters throughout the book.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting.
Are we ready to talk about Stella?
I feel like throughout the story, I was waiting for this redemptive character arc for Stella.
Hmm.
They leave Mallard. Her and Desiree are struggling. And at one point, Stella just kind of decides she's fed up and she decides that she'll be able to be more successful if she decides to pass as white at this point. And then she completely cuts herself off from her twin sister Desiree, and her life unfolds the way it unfolds. But I just kept waiting for this redemptive moment where it would make more sense, Stella's actions or something could be explained, but that didn't happen.
She just progressively continued to surprise me, but in the worst ways. To me, the big question I kept wondering was it worth it? Was it worth it to cut out your sister, your mother, to never have a fully open and honest relationship with your daughter and your husband who have no idea that you're actually black? Like, a big theme in the book was how good she's become at lying and, playing someone else. And she
Hmm.
even talks about how isolating it is because there's no one in her life anymore who knows who she really is.
Hmm.
And to me, I just always wonder, is that worth it?
Right. The fact that the twins witnessed their dad being senselessly murdered for the color of his skin, as light as it was, still, it was for the color of his skin. And then to see her as an adult now with a child of her own, fully trying to convince herself of her new identity that she's white. And the fact that
Hmm.
she then turns and is completely prejudiced to her neighbors, and to see the way that Stella engages with them and treats them, that was hard to read.
For her, like you said, to just feed into the prejudice and the way that she treats other black people throughout this story, just baffling to me. Like there's a point when, when the black family that moves in, it's the Walkers, and they have a young daughter who is similar in age to Stella's daughter. And Stella finds them playing together and runs outside, grabs her daughter by the wrist, and drags her back in. No explanation, no nothing. And when they get inside, her daughter asks, like, "Oh, what did I do wrong?" And she's like, "We don't play with N words, hard
Mm-hmm.
R." And my jaw dropped. Like, I just couldn't believe that she would even utter those words,
Mm-hmm.
and to not only say that, but to say that to your, I think 5 or 6 year old daughter, like what you are saying is about a community you belong to, but that's how you want your daughter to feel
Right.
about who you
Yeah.
are, essentially. You know what I mean? That's what you want to teach her. Like,
Right. No, it's exactly what you said. I think that right there was a major turning point because at that point we realized we know, just as the readers, what Stella's inner thoughts are and everything. However, at that point, she's like, there's no turning back, you know? Like,
yeah, yeah.
she has completely made her final transition into a white woman, which is very much reverse Rachel Dolezal. Yeah, so I felt like a lot of Stella's beef with the Walkers is just simple. She resented Loretta. A lot of times she would discuss how Loretta just looked so happy. Every now and then, Loretta's friends would come over who were all black women. And she would, discuss how they were drinking in the middle of the day, playing games. And it's almost like Loretta represents what Stella can never have because of this choice that she's made. And so she resents the hell out of her for it.
Yeah, I found like speaking about Stella's relationship with Loretta, I feel like there was two really interesting points there. And one, like you're right, I think there is a level of resentment there because I think maybe in a way too, like she sees that Loretta got to the same point in life that she did, but she did not give up her identity to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's just kind of maybe I don't want to say a slap in the face for Stella, but maybe it's definitely something that makes her think, did I make the right choice, or this didn't have to be the only path. And then the other thing that I don't like about Stella's relationship with Loretta is Loretta was genuinely open and warm and kind to Stella.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she Loretta obviously recognizes that there is a difference between the two of them because she, like everyone else, believes that Stella is white. But she
Mm-hmm.
invites Stella into her home. She forgives Stella when she apologizes for yanking her daughter away from Loretta's daughter. And I just thought it was really selfish of Stella in their relationship because she does grow to really enjoy Loretta's company, and like she starts going over there every day, and she even mentions how she looks forward to the phone calls because she can't wait for Loretta to call and invite her over. And
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, I think part of her does remind her of Desiree, and it kind of makes her feel like she has her sister even though she doesn't really. But what I
Mm-hmm.
don't like is she's so willing to be Loretta's friend and love and care for her so much in private. But the
Mm-hmm.
second she's called out about it in public, acts like she's never talked to her day in her life, doesn't even
Mm-hmm.
like her really. And it's just all for show. And there's many things with Stella where I'm like, ugh, that's the last straw. There are so many last straws. They were all last straws. But
Literally.
it was after, so Stella and her husband throw a big Christmas party for the whole neighborhood. They do not invite Loretta because her husband doesn't even know Stella and Loretta are friends because she keeps it a secret. And so she gets confronted at the party. People are telling her, oh, we've seen you hanging out with her. Then after that, she goes and tells someone how Reg, which is Loretta's husband, makes her uncomfortable. And then after that, they ended up getting two bricks thrown through their living room
Oh my
window.
gosh.
One of the times, their young daughter, the Walkers, get bricks thrown through their windows. One of those times, their young daughter was watching TV and she had to go to the hospital and get the glass removed from her leg.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it's just like, when you said those words exactly what you were doing and trying to distance yourself from them, you ruin their lives to a degree. They ended
Mm-hmm.
up moving out of the neighborhood. And it also feeds on this really, really prevalent issue throughout history of people taking the word of a white woman over a black
Mm-hmm.
man without fail. Always. Black men are always seen as a predator to white women. They're, never ever believed when it comes to white women versus black men. And so for
Mm-hmm.
her to just like so freely feed into that when she
Mm-hmm.
saw what happened to her father over the very same accusation that he said something dirty about a white woman and he was killed for it. So I just couldn't
Mm-hmm.
believe she would so freely say something like that when she knows the repercussions that, something she deemed as a casual statement could have. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. I realized I like blocked that out of my memory, but that whole interaction and the fact that she said that, because there's also a point when Brit Bennett discusses how Reg was a great neighbor. Like he went out of his way to just be friendly. He even went so far as to help her bring in groceries one day. He's just completely unproblematic, kind, good-hearted. She makes that accusation. It's even more like just more salt in the wound because she knows that he's a good person.
Like the way that she treated Loretta when they first met, like that in and of itself, I could have understood if Loretta never really forgave her or wanted to be friendly with her after that. But
Mm-hmm.
she looked past it and invited her into her home and her life and her daughter's life. And, you know,
Yeah. Just before we get further into Stella, kind of going with this whole redemption arc, I would say that instance right there, like once that happened, I kind of felt like I don't care what else Stella does. I don't care if she like starts a charity and is this great person for the rest of the book and like that you can't really undo that, that really
Right.
spoke to her character. It spoke to who she was deep down.
While we're on Stella, like a major theme in the book is Desiree constantly having this wonder of, what happened to Stella. And I just, first of all, as Desiree, can't imagine that pain. I mean, we both have siblings and like we know what a sibling relationship is like. We're not
Yeah.
twins, so I guess we don't know that bond. Although I always joke, like, my brother and I are so close in age, we're practically twins.
No, same.
Um,
Same. I always let him know 1 year, 11 months, and 2 weeks apart.
yeah, my mom flips it around and throws it in my face. She's like, "You're only 10 and a half months older than him. So, like, I don't know why you always get off thinking you can be in charge of him." And I'm like, "Because I can." So, but yeah, so like as Desiree, I just can't imagine that hurt of, you love somebody so wholly and completely, you trust somebody, and for them to leave you without a glance, like just the fact that Stella never tried to get in contact with her, never tried to reach out to
Hmm.
her, like,
Yeah, and I feel like it just drives home what you said earlier. Was it really worth it, Stella? Because I would say from the moment she makes that choice down to, the final pages in the book, she's miserable. Like she has
yeah,
this major secret. She spends her whole life trying to hide the fact that she has a twin sister, that she
damn
is
near, like,
black.
dang near spends her whole life in a state of nausea, like worried someone's gonna figure out her secret.
Right. She still, she works so hard to try and prevent Kennedy from finding out the truth and her husband. That I'm sorry, that sounds pretty miserable to me. Like, congratulations, you got the American dream, you got the white picket fence, and at what cost? Yeah. And I think, that was really a clever way to really drive home why colorism is so bad and so like insidious because or through the character of Stella and through the fact that she did all that to, discount her identity just to be miserable for, her the rest of her life.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to touch on your point about her and Kennedy's relationship because I think that Kennedy wanted to have an open, close relationship with her mom, and Stella constantly kept her at an arm's length, and Kennedy could never understand why. And
Hmm.
I think that really played a role in the way that Kennedy even developed.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting with Kennedy because I just get the sense that, if Kennedy had a different upbringing and if she was raised differently, she I definitely feel like she would have been a different person as she grew up. And we see that
Mm.
right off the bat when she meets Jude for the first time. you know they literally their moms are a spitting image of each other, but because of race and class and privilege, their lives play out just as polar opposites. That was so crazy to see that play out in that moment in the book.
Yeah, I really like the way you worded that. It's such an interesting parallel. Brit Bennett showing like the choices that their moms made in their lives and the direct impact it had on both their daughters and how dramatically different their lives are.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was just like such a jarring scene to see, what the other's life could have been, how one could have had the other's life and vice versa.
Right. And I feel like, had Kennedy had a different upbringing, I could be wrong, but I kind of got the sense that she wanted to learn more and that she didn't want to be ignorant, but it's all she knew. I mean, Stella is her mom, she's her mother's daughter. I felt at times she was trying to challenge these notions.
I do really enjoy the latter half of the book and seeing kind of the paths that these two young women go on. And I actually think it's kind of interesting what Britt Bennett does there because it's like as we followed Jude and Kennedy throughout the years, as we mentioned, they had just such drastically different lives. Kennedy was born into wealth. She was born into privilege. She was born into, having every opportunity available to her that she could want or need.
Hmm.
Whereas Jude did not. I mean, she grew up witnessing her father beat her mother. Then she had to move and live into a place where she was told every day how unattractive she was, and she kind of she had to fight for like the things that she wanted or the things that she needed. Interesting, like
Yeah. Although Kennedy had all this privilege, all this access, in a way, she went on to be, somewhat unhappy like her mother. Whereas
mhm.
Jude, who from the jump had so much thrown at her, she was able to be happy and, follow her dream.
It's just like all that privilege, all that opportunity only got Kennedy really so far, whereas Jude was able to far and away surpass the means from which she came from,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
despite everything.
exactly. And while we're on the topic of Kennedy, I just want to discuss her dating life. So, from what they describe, she's always in and out of relationships. Just in her life in general, she kind of goes with her heart. But at one point, she dates a black man named France in New York. And I just want to get your thoughts on their relationship because we're like, it was just very troubling for me.
Yes. So, um, leading up to her talking about her relationship with France in the book, she's talking about how she always had like an affinity for black men and how she would
Mm-hmm.
like watch TV with her dad or basketball with her dad just to catch a glimpse of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And,
Mm-hmm.
she just talks about how she always had these crushes on black men specifically, but that she knew she could never tell anyone. The way she describes it, a little fetishy, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah,
I
100%.
wasn't, really down with that because it was just kind of like just the way in which she described it. And if you read it, you know what I'm talking about. I just, it was a little troubling.
Mm-hmm.
And then her relationship with France in and of itself is very troubling. He says things to her like he also mentions she's the fourth white woman that he's dated
Mm-hmm.
and makes it seem like he is a what is he, a professor, an assistant professor? He's some kind
Yeah.
of intellectual, we'll call him
Yeah.
that. But he presents himself in such a way as like he's also seeking out white women. And there's a part at this point in the story, Jude has confronted Kennedy about her mom and telling her like your mom is lying to you, and she's black and this is where she's from and she has a twin sister. She's presented Kennedy with this information,
Mm-hmm.
and Kennedy comes home and she talks to France and she's like, would you still hold on, let me find the exact quote. She said, would you still love me if I wasn't white? And
Mm-hmm.
he said, no, because you wouldn't be you. And I was like,
What?
I just literally anyone, whether you're white, black, Asian, Hispanic, you are more than just the color of your skin. So for him to say to her, no, you wouldn't be you, like her whiteness is all that she is, all that she has to offer to their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I like if someone said that to me, our relationship would be done right there. Tell me how you really feel about me. I just couldn't understand why he would say that to her. And
Mm-hmm.
also, something that she mentions is that he asks her to call her the N word, hard R, when they are in bed together. Don't understand what he gets out of that, what kind of pleasure or interest, or I don't know what it is, but he gets his jollies off on it, and so she obliges, which also is like, just because somebody asks you to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. Like I
Right.
feel like Kennedy should know like that's not okay and just say like I'm not comfortable with that.
Right. Yeah, that I had to take a pause at that moment because I mean, it's kind of like you were saying earlier. She definitely, I would say, fetishizes black men and has for most of her life. And
I just want to add on that too is like I feel like sometimes people think that that doesn't exist. They're like, oh, they
right.
just have a preference, but there's this very specific pattern of behavior. Like it's like a conquest thing for you. You want
Hmm.
them because they're black, not
Hmm.
because you are into them. You know what I mean?
I'm so glad that you brought up this whole idea of racial preferences because to me, a preference is I'm a night owl, or I prefer to listen to jazz music, or I
Yes.
like coffee instead of tea. Those are preferences. Oftentimes, at least in my personal experience from what I've read online, it seems as if these racial preferences are often immediately attached to stereotypes. So it's like, well, why
Mm-hmm.
don't you like dark skinned black women? Because they're loud and they're, this is just stuff that I've heard or experienced myself. They're loud,
Right.
they're rude, they're this. It's just negative stereotypes that have been generalized to discuss a whole community. And so anytime I hear a racial preference, it's it's just not that's not a thing. That's wrong.
Yeah,
Um
and it's like you haven't met everyone in the world. So for you to make a blanket statement of I only date blank or I will never date blank, it's like, well, why? Because you haven't met everybody in the world. You can't make blanket statements like that because then the only reason that you have made that statement is based on their race. You don't know who they are as a person.
exactly. And so Yeah, like anytime I hear that, I just immediately think either A, you're racist, or B, you're prejudiced, but there's no validity in that. There's no validity in racial preference. And so the fact that she has that racial preference towards black men, and then the fact that he does towards white women, which is apparent in his dating history, they both have very just outdated, problematic views towards dating.
There were a couple things that I wanted to touch on that weren't necessarily character specific, but they were things that I noticed that characters said, and I was like, I want to discuss this with India.
Hmm.
So there's a part, and it's told from Stella's point of view, and I believe it's roughly after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and the riots were happening. And Stella's neighbor, who was white, said the world was unrecognizable to her now, but Stella thought it looked the same as it always had.
Hmm.
And I love that line because it's just like when you're not a part of a community that is affected by something, when you're able to kind of just turn a blind eye because you know that something's not going to have an impact on you. For her
Right.
neighbor to be like, with the civil rights movement and people demanding justice and equality and finally these things being brought to the forefront. And so for her to say, oh, the world is unrecognizable because so many things are changing because colored families moving into our neighborhood. And then Stella in her mind is like, to me, it looks the same as it always had because that was Stella's reality the whole time that she was growing up,
Right.
until she decided to start passing.
And then also, I think in that same moment, or like that same part of the book, Blake makes a comment when
He
I think they're watching
does.
TV. Yeah, and he says, I don't have the exact quote. Maybe you have it on hand.
Yeah, he said, I'll never understand why they do that, destroy their own neighborhood, watching the riots. And I'm like,
Mm,
how many times did we hear that just a few weeks ago? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
how timely. It was just like you said, it's chilling. This was written in the perspective of being 50 plus years ago.
And it's especially interesting too because Brit Bennett does a good job kind of giving us a little bit of backstory into Blake's character. And she specifically mentions that he's made comments while interacting with Stella, saying things like, MLK is so well spoken.
Calling a black person articulate and well spoken is a microaggression.
It's microaggressive. Stop doing
Like,
it.
that's not a compliment. Just stop. Thanks.
Yes, the implications, I shouldn't even, we're not going to even get into that. The implications there are offensive. Please stop doing that. So yes, he's made that comment. And then he also says he disagrees with the like immense police brutality against protesters that was televised. So then for him to make that comment and say that he doesn't understand why they're quote unquote tearing down their own communities, it's so, and I mean, like you said, that rings true to literally right now in 2020, the civil unrest that's going on and the social justice movement. The fact is, I just think to myself when I hear people make comments like that, don't you think for someone to have that much of an emotional response to something, don't you think that they're very passionate about what's going on? Like, just, I mean, just if you think in your regular life, like when you get upset about something, to be that upset to, burn something down, that's coming from a place of hurt.
Yeah. It's just something
Yeah.
like I feel like if you've never been directly affected by any of these things, it can be hard to understand the root of that pain and that anger. And it's just something you can't explain. Like,
It's just a privileged thing to say, and it's just very distancing because, kind of like in our previous episode when we discussed Little Fires Everywhere, we talked about how Elena thought that she was a good person, even though it was very clear that she wasn't genuine. I feel
mhm.
like similarly, Blake probably thinks that he's a good person. He probably would be like, I'm not racist. My neighbor's black.
And something that the author mentioned about Blake's past that I thought was also like pretty telling of who he is as a person now. He talks about being a child and how he had this doll. It was a black doll. And one day he went to look for it and it had been like torn up and like the cotton was ripped out of it. And he was looking at the doll and he thought it was interesting because he would have assumed that the cotton on the inside of the doll also would have been brown. Like people think, there's such fundamental differences between humans based on the color of your skin. Like we're not all human.
Kind of like in that same vein, just the fact that the whole time the readers know Stella's true identity. At one point, Stella meets Blake's family, and immediately his mom disapproves of her. She
Mm-hmm.
has a slight Southern accent accent from being from, Louisiana. And the mom's like, no, she's not a part of our class. I don't approve of this. Like, it's so clever, Brit Bennett, the way she layered race and class and gender throughout the story, because finally Stella, she's achieved her dream. She's able to go on in her adult life passing as a white woman. And even then, because of her class
It wasn't
level,
good enough.
right. I'm like, wow, that's good writing.
I agree. Something else I noticed in the book and that I took notes on because I wanted to talk about was, so Stella ends up going back to school. She becomes a professor of statistics at Santa Monica College, and she has a professor who's kind of like her mentor.
Mm.
And she is a white woman as well, and she's described as being a feminist. Stella talks about how she's just a very big advocate for women's rights, and Stella straight up asks her, like, she says, hold on, let me find the exact quote. Stella asks her if she has any colored women who join her protests, and Peg, that's her mentor, she said Peg prickles and says they have their own concerns, but they're welcome to join us in the fight. You can't say that you are an advocate for women if you are not going to advocate for all women.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just plain ignorant to think that these issues that you're talking about are not something that all women are facing.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, especially now, I felt like Brit Bennett did another good job at, kind of touching on feminism in today's community, in today's society, just because it definitely happens a lot. Like, and the fact that Peg is supposed to be, progressive, she has very liberal ideas, but the fact that her feminism isn't intersectional and that she's not willing to, also
Acknowledge
advocate.
the oppression of other women, like not just the fight for white women, but for all women.
Right, exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up too, just because, as progressive as I'm sure Peg thinks she is, you just can't have such a narrow-minded perception of femininity. I'm really glad Brit Bennett included that part in the book. And I appreciated the fact that, this was not an easy read at all. From the jump, the description of Mallard, she's not afraid to tackle, like, she tackles so much in this novel. It's so glaringly obvious why colorism is wrong and why it's so damaging to the Black community. And we see that so apparently through Stella's life. And, although this is a fictional story and although a bulk of it takes place some decades ago, it's still prevalent. It's still happening right now. And yeah, I feel like people need to go and read this and then do further research and just educating, studying, and, understanding. Racism is just the general bullet point, but then there's so many drop downs where you can just keep going, and racism manifests into colorism, and then it manifests into racial preferences and dating. It just keeps going and going and going. And so I really need people to go ahead and read this book, take into account all the different perspectives of this fictional story and also draw parallels to how it's happening right now in real life.
I completely agree with everything you said, and I really like what Brit Bennett did here of telling stories that are not often told or approaching topics that are not often discussed in mainstream media. Like we were saying at the start, colorism is not something that is talked about as much. I mean, like we obviously, we spend a lot of time discussing injustice and racism and prejudice, but people don't really talk about, the subset of colorism that arises from that and how terrible it can be within the community. And so just, telling that story in such a beautiful way and just showing how that can go on to shape so much of your life. I also really appreciate that she shared Reese's journey as well. Like, as we mentioned, Reese is transitioning, and that's also a story that is unfortunately not always at the forefront of any media, whether that be TV or books, film, what have you. And so for us to get to go on these different journeys with these characters and understand, how their life experiences have shaped who they are and who they continue to be, I think she did a really, really great job of telling these stories.
Yeah, definitely. Like we were discussing in the first episode, representation is so important. And I mean, this could be a whole nother episode, but there's definitely some issues in the Black community from just what I've seen myself and from what I've heard. But there's definitely an issue with transphobia, homophobia,
Definitely.
just very ignorant and wrong thoughts in regards to the LGBT plus community. And so the fact that, she was able to layer all of these different things in this book, it's definitely commendable. It's a hard read, but it's a necessary read. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today. For more updates, you can be sure to follow us on Twitter at BookSolidPod, on Instagram at BookSolidPodcast, like us on Facebook at BookSolidPodcast, and also join our group. Please stay tuned after the outro for more information on our donation of the week.
For the donation of the week, we have chosen the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, America's premier legal organization fighting for racial injustice. It is no secret that people of color face immense inequality and injustice in our legal system. The NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund seeks to achieve structural changes to expand democracy and fulfill the promise of equality for all Americans. We all deserve to be equal. We all deserve to be heard. For more information and how to donate, please visit our show notes or go to our Facebook group, Book Solid Podcast, and click on Donation of the Week. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode.